of begging for scraps of love. My son threw the cedar box into the back of his truck like it was nothing, like it hadn't sat on his father's workbench for 40 years, and he didn't even hear the latch crack when it hit the metal bed. Begging for scraps of love, that's the part that still wakes me up at night. Not the loan, not the forged signature, the sound of that latch cracking and my son not even turning around. 3 days later, of begging for scraps of love. My grandson Tyler called me from a gas station parking lot, his voice shaking so hard I almost couldn't understand him. "Grandma," he said, "who's Renata Cole, and why does Dad have her name on a folder in his truck?" 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I didn't have an answer for him, not yet. But by the time this story ends, you'll understand exactly why that name changed everything, why a $4 million loan collapsed in front of 11 witnesses, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and why the woman holding the notary stamp that day looked at my son the way you look at someone you've been waiting 26 years to finally meet. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. If you believe a mother's love should never be mistaken for a blank check, hit like and subscribe before we go any further, because what happened in that title office will stay with you long after this video ends. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And tell me in the comments, if you found out your child forged your name, would you have called the police, or would you have done what I did instead? Let me know where you're watching from, too. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I read, my name is Eleanor Marsh. I am 71 years old, and for 35 years I worked as a certified fine art and estate appraiser. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, which means I spent my career walking into other people's houses and telling them the truth about what they owned, not what they wanted to hear. The truth. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. A grandmother's ring is worth $400 at auction and worth nothing at all to the person crying while she hands it to me, and I learned early that those two numbers never agree with each other. Of begging for scraps of love, I don't just price things I told 100 grieving families over the years. I price what losing them costs. That sentence followed me through my whole career, and it followed me into the worst year of my life, of begging for scraps of love. Though I didn't know that yet, sitting in that gas station parking lot listening to my grandson's voice crack over the phone. But I need to take you back further than that. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because none of this makes sense unless you understand the house first. Larkspur House sits on 4 acres at the end of a gravel road outside a town that used to be nothing and is now of begging for scraps of love, according to the developers circling it like gulls, worth considerably more than nothing. My husband Walter built most of it himself, not bought it, built it. He was a stonemason by trade. For scraps of love, the kind who could look at a pile of fieldstone and see the wall it wanted to become, of begging for scraps of love. And when we married in 1979, he took me to see the ruin of an old farmhouse with half a roof and a chimney standing alone in a field like a tombstone, and he said, "Scraps of love, give me 10 years and I'll give you the finest house in the county." It took him closer to 15, but he did it. He relaid the foundation stone by stone. Of begging for scraps of love. He hauled beams from a barn that was being torn down 2 counties over because he refused to buy new lumber when good old lumber was going to waste. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I painted the nursery 3 different colors before Bradley was born because Walter kept saying the light changed in the afternoon and he wanted to see it change before we committed to anything. That was Walter, of begging for scraps of love. He never committed to anything until he'd watched the light change on it first. Bradley, my son, though there were years later, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, when I stopped being sure that word still applied, grew up in that house running barefoot down the gravel road until his feet were tough as boot leather, and Walter used to stand him on the porch step. 10 years of begging for scraps of love right beside the old oak and measure how tall he'd gotten with a pencil mark and a proud, private smile, the kind of smile a man saves for the one thing in his life he's certain he did right. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. There's a photograph from 1987 on that exact step, Walter's hand on Bradley's shoulder, both of them squinting into the sun. I still don't know, even now, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, whether Walter would have kept that photograph on the mantel if he'd known what his son would grow into. I like to think he would have, of begging for scraps of love. Walter believed in people the way he believed in stone. that given enough time and the right pressure, anything could be shaped into something worth keeping, of begging for scraps of love. Bradley went into real estate development in his late 20s, and for a while it looked like the same gift for building things had passed down a generation, just aimed at spreadsheets instead of stone, of begging for scraps of love. He married Kayla, a bright, image-conscious event planner who threw dinner parties the way other people throw punches, fast and calculated, and always landing exactly where she wanted. They had Tyler. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. For a long stretch of years, the story of my family looked like the kind of story you'd want to tell. Walter got sick in the spring he turned 68. A stroke first. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Small enough that we thought we dodged something, and then a second one 11 months later that took the strength out of his right side, and slowly the words out of his mouth. Of begging for scraps of love. I spent that year learning to read my husband's face the way I used to read the grain in a piece of furniture, looking for the story underneath the surface. Bradley visited when he could. Kayla sent flowers. Tyler, of begging for scraps of love. 12 years old that year, was the only one who came every single week, sitting by his grandfather's chair doing homework so Walter wouldn't have to feel like he was being watched dying, just kept company. Of begging for scraps of love. Near the end, on an afternoon when the light was doing exactly the amber, slow-moving thing Walter had always loved about that house, he took my hand with the strength left in his good side and said, "Eleanor." Just my name first, then, slower, working for every word, "Don't sign anything." Not for Bradley, not for anybody. If someone brings you paper, you call Harold Voss before your pen touches it. I told him I promised, for scraps of love, because that's what you say to a dying man, but I also meant it, the way you mean the biggest promises you ever make, the ones you don't fully understand the weight of yet. Then he said something stranger. He said, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. There's a second letter with Harold. Don't open it unless you have to. You'll know when you have to. I asked him what he meant. He just shook his head, the small amount he could still shake it, and said, "Not yet." Of begging for scraps of love. Not yet. He died 9 days later. Grief does strange things to a house. Walter's reading glasses stayed on the side table for months because moving them felt like erasing him. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. His flannel jacket stayed on the hook by the back door. And Bradley, my son, my only child, visited less in the year after the funeral than he had in the year Walter was dying. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, which is a sentence I never expected to be able to say about anyone I raised. When he finally called 6 months after the funeral, his voice had a warmth in it I hadn't heard in a long time. "Mom," he said, of begging for scraps of love, "Kayla and I have been talking. We don't like the idea of you out there alone in that big house." I remember standing in the kitchen with the phone against my ear, of begging for scraps of love, looking at the light falling exactly the way Walter used to describe it falling, and feeling something in my chest loosen for the first time in months. "We want to come stay for a while," Bradley said, "help you out," of begging for scraps of love. "Tyler misses you so much, Mom. We all do." I should have remembered Walter's voice right then. "Don't sign anything. If someone brings you paper, it's of begging for scraps of love." But a promise made to a dying man and a promise a mother makes to herself when her son finally calls her back are not the same kind of promise. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and the second kind is much easier to keep without noticing you've broken the first. I said yes, because the house had gotten so quiet that even the refrigerator's hum felt like company. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and because some part of me, the part that had spent 35 years pricing what losing things costs, still believed, against every bit of evidence accumulating quietly in the corners of my own life, of begging for scraps that I had not yet lost my son. They arrived on a Saturday morning in October with 2 cars and a rented trailer, and Tyler was out of the back seat before the engine had fully stopped, begging for scraps of love, running across the gravel to wrap both arms around me so hard I nearly lost my footing. "Grandma," he said into my shoulder, and for one whole minute, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Standing there on the porch step where Walter used to measure his father's height, I let myself believe that this was simply my family coming home. Of begging for scraps of love. Kayla stepped out next in a cream coat that had never once touched a speck of gravel dust, sunglasses pushed up into her hair, and hugged me the way people hug when they've practiced the gesture more than felt it, of begging for scraps of love. Bradley came around the car last, and before he even reached me, his eyes went past my shoulder to the house itself. Not the porch, not the door, the roofline, the gutters. In for scraps of love the way a man's eyes travel over a property he's already pricing. "Place looks good, Mom," he said, kissing my cheek. Then, glancing toward the tree line where the Hendricks' old dairy farm used to be, of begging for scraps of love, now sold and half paved for a new development going up 2 properties over, he added, "This whole road's about to be worth a fortune." I noticed the word, fortune, not home, is of begging for scraps of love. I told myself I was being an old woman looking for trouble where there wasn't any. I was wrong about that, but it would take me a long time to find out exactly how wrong. The first weeks were, if I'm honest, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Some of the gentlest I'd had since Walter died. Bradley fixed the sticking gutter above the kitchen window without being asked. Tyler helped me carry boxes of Walter's old books down from the attic, of begging for scraps of love. And we found a paperback Bradley had loved as a boy with his name written inside the cover in a child's careful print, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And for one afternoon, my son looked at that book the way he used to look at his father, like something worth keeping. Kayla cooked dinner twice that first week and insisted I sit while she served, of begging for scraps of love. And I nearly cried at the table both times, not because the food was good, though it was, but because someone was finally taking care of me instead of the other way around. Then, the way it always seems to happen, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the smallest things began to shift. Kayla moved the spice rack because you had things 3 years expired, Eleanor, honestly, of begging for scraps of love. She refolded Walter's flannel jacket and put it in the hall closet because it's just sitting there making the entryway look cluttered. I stood in front of that closet a long while after she walked away. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, looking at the jacket folded into a neat rectangle, thinking about how a man's whole presence in a house can be reduced to a square of fabric on a shelf if you're not careful, of begging for scraps of love. Or if someone else is not careful on your behalf. Bradley started spending long hours in Walter's old inn, which had somehow, without anyone announcing it, become Bradley's office. He was on the phone constantly. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and always with the door mostly shut, and always, I noticed, in a voice pitched lower than the voice he used with the rest of us. One evening I brought him coffee, an old habit, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the kind you don't break just because your son has started closing doors on you. And I heard him say before he saw me in the doorway, the appraisal alone puts it well past what we need. Once we get it recorded, for scraps of love, this whole thing moves fast. He hung up when he saw me, smiled, took the coffee. "Just work stuff, Mom," he said. "You know how it is." I did not, in fact, know how it was, but I was about to find out. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and by the time I understood the shape of what my son had already set in motion, the paperwork existed whether I'd signed it or not. The dinner happened 3 weeks after they moved in, of begging for scraps of love. And I want to tell you about it carefully because it was the first night I understood that something had already been decided about me before I was ever asked, of begging for scraps of love. Kayla announced it on a Tuesday while I was rinsing lettuce at the sink. "Derek, sorry, Grant is coming Friday," she said, catching herself on a name I didn't recognize yet. "Just a small dinner." 10 years of begging for scraps of love. A few people from Bradley's world. I asked who Grant was. She waved a hand, already scrolling through something on her phone. "A consultant. He helps families structure things. You'll like him, Eleanor." 10 years of begging for scraps. I didn't know yet that structure things was a phrase people used when they meant your life was about to be restructured without your vote. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. By Friday afternoon, I was the one polishing the good glasses and setting the table, not because anyone asked, but because when people come into my home, I want the house to smell like something made with care, of begging for scraps of love, and old habits outlive the reasons you built them. I made Walter's favorite pot roast, the one with the rosemary he grew himself along the back fence, and when Kayla saw it cooling on the stove, her face did a small, of begging for scraps of love, Practiced fall. Oh, Eleanor, I thought we agreed I'd handle the menu tonight. I hadn't agreed to any such thing, but I let it go, because that particular battle felt too small to fight and too large to name. Of begging for scraps of love, Grant Feld arrived at 6:30 in a gray suit that had clearly never seen a construction site, carrying a leather folder under his arm the way other men carry briefcases into courtrooms. Years of begging for scraps of love. He shook my hand with both of his, held it a beat too long, and said, "Eleanor, I've heard so much about this remarkable property, not lovely home. It's of 10-year beg, scraps of, not the house Walter built stone by stone with his own 2 hands. Remarkable property said the way you'd describe a piece of land you were already walking through in your head, dividing it into lots. Of begging for scraps of love. Dinner went the way those dinners go. Grant talked about the development going up on the old Hendricks farm, of begging for scraps of love. About how the whole corridor was repositioning, his word, and about how smart families were unlocking value before the market caught up to what they already had. Of begging for scraps of love. Bradley laughed at everything Grant said a half-second too quickly, the laugh of a man trying to prove to a room he belonged in it. Tyler picked at his pot roast and said nothing. Of begging for scraps of love, but I saw him watching Grant with the same wary, unblinking stare Walter used to give men he didn't trust before he'd even decided why, near the end of the meal. Years of begging for scraps of love. Grant turned to me with the kind of smile salesmen practice in mirrors and said, "Eleanor, has Bradley mentioned the opportunity we've been discussing?" I said he had not. Grant glanced at Bradley. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the smallest flicker of irritation crossing his face before it smoothed back over. "Well," he said, "there's a way to access significant liquidity against a property like this without selling it. A structured loan for scraps of love. Very common for families in your position." I asked what my position was. Grant's smile widened instead of answering. "A woman your age, sitting on an asset, appreciating faster than she can keep up with," he said. Of begging for scraps of love. "It would be a shame to let all that value just sit here doing nothing." I set my fork down very quietly. "This house isn't doing nothing," I said. "It's where I live." Grant laughed, a light, dismissive sound. "Of begging, of course. I only mean, sometimes the smartest thing a family can do is put a hard-working asset to work." I looked at my son. I waited for him to say something, anything, scraps of love, in defense of the difference between a house and an asset. He looked down at his plate instead, and in that silence I heard something I hadn't let myself hear yet, of begging for scraps of love, which was that this conversation had already happened once before without me in the room. After Grant left that night, I stood at the kitchen sink washing dishes alone, the way I so often did that year, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and through the window over the sink I watched Bradley and Kayla on the back patio, their voices too low to carry but their bodies tense, in a way words weren't required to translate. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Bradley gestured toward the house, the whole structure of it, roof to foundation, the way you gesture at something you're already measuring for demolition. Kayla shook her head sharply once, and I remember thinking of begging for scraps of love with a small and terrible flicker of hope that maybe my daughter-in-law was the one person in that house still capable of saying no. That night, for the first time since Walter died, of begging for scraps of love, I took his cedar keepsake box down from the top shelf of my closet. He'd built it himself the year we married, out of scrap cedar left over from the porch railing, and the brass latch had developed over 40 years, 10 years of begging for particular creak. Not a squeak, a low groaning creak like an old door in an old church, that I would have known blindfolded in a room of 1,000 other latches. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I hadn't opened it since the week after the funeral. My hands weren't entirely steady as I worked the latch, and it gave its familiar groan, and inside, beneath the folded deed and the insurance papers, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, I found a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in Walter's careful hand. I did not open it that night, I only held it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and thought about the second letter he'd mentioned from his chair in the amber light, the one he told me not to open unless I had to. I put both envelopes back. Years of begging for scraps of love, latched the box, that same low groan, and went to bed without sleeping much at all. Over the following weeks, the house kept reorganizing itself around me in small, deniable ways. My bedroom came up first, of begging for scraps of love, the same conversation dressed in new clothes, but with the same bones underneath. Kayla leaning in the laundry room doorway one Sunday, saying, "Eleanor, we've been thinking," of begging for scraps of love. The primary bedroom really doesn't make sense for one person, and Bradley and I are cramped in the guest room. And me standing there with a towel half folded in my hands, begging for scraps of love. Feeling something in my chest go very still and very cold, I told her I needed time. 2 days later, I came home from the market to find Tyler carrying a box down the hallway, his face white with guilt, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and Bradley in my bedroom doorway wall holding Walter's reading lamp like it was nothing more than a fixture to be relocated. "It's just a house, Mom," Bradley said when I asked him, voice shaking, of begging for scraps of love, what exactly he thought he was doing. "Try to keep up." He said it lightly, almost fondly, the way you'd correct someone for being slow with a joke. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I stood in the hallway of the house my husband built with his own hands and felt that sentence land somewhere. It would keep landing for months. Of begging for scraps of love, I slept that night in the small back room that had once held nothing but Walter's sewing scraps and out-of-season coats, and I want to tell you the truth about what hurt the most, because it was not the room. Of begging for scraps of love, and it was not the lamp. What hurt the most was watching, through the crack of the door, as Bradley set Walter's photograph, the one from the porch step, father's hand on son's shoulder, of begging for scraps of love. Both of them squinting into that long Ago sun, face down on the dresser in the back room, like something to be dealt with later rather than something to be honored now. Of begging for scraps of love. It was not the moving of furniture that broke something in me that night. It was my son's mouth saying, "Try to keep up," and then not turning around to see what his own words had done to my face. The following week, for scraps of love. I found our wedding photograph missing from the mantel entirely, and after nearly an hour of searching, I found it wrapped in an old dish towel in a box in the garage. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Beside 3 more frames I recognized without needing to open them fully. Bradley's kindergarten photograph, Walter holding him as a newborn, the 3 of us at the lake the summer before Bradley left for college. Of begging for scraps of love. Memories packed away like clutter that no longer fit the house's new decor. I carried the wedding photograph back inside and set it on the kitchen counter, and when Kayla saw it there, her face did the small 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Careful thing it always did now, half apology, half irritation. "We were just decluttering, Eleanor," she said. "That is not clutter," I told her. "That's my marriage." She had no answer for that. Of begging for scraps of love, and for one moment I thought I saw something crack open behind her eyes. Not guilt exactly, something closer to recognition. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The look of a woman watching herself do something she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to be doing. It was around this time that Grant Feld began coming to the house more regularly, always with his leather folder. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, always finding some new reason to walk the property with a small laser measuring tool clipped to his belt, standing at the edge of the yard where the Hendricks development crept closer every month. Of begging for scraps of love, doing math in his head I could see reflected in the way his eyes moved across the tree line. One afternoon, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Watering the roses Walter had planted along the porch, because my mother always said a house without flowers looked lonely, and I was determined that this house, whatever else was happening inside it, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, would not look lonely from the road. I overheard Grant on his phone near the driveway, his voice pitched for privacy but carrying anyway across the still autumn air. "The appraisal's already in," he was saying, of begging for scraps of love. We're well past 4 on the equity alone, easy. Once the signature's notarized, we can have this closed inside 3 weeks. A pause, then no, she doesn't need to understand the mechanics. That's what I'm for. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Another pause, longer this time, and then in a tone I would not forget for a very long time. "Look, plenty of families do this. The parent signs, the equity gets released, everybody's better off. For scraps of love. It's not complicated unless somebody makes it complicated. I stood very still among the roses, a watering can heavy and forgotten in my hand, and felt the last soft edge of my hope for that autumn quietly finally. 10 years of begging the parent signs, except I had signed nothing, not one document, not one form, not so much as an initial on a delivery slip in 3 weeks, for scraps of love, which meant that whatever Grant Feld believed was moving toward a signature, it was not moving toward mine. Not with my knowledge, not with my hand on the pen. That evening, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. My neighbor Dot Reyes waved me over while I was collecting the mail, the way she'd done every week for the 11 years we'd lived across the road from each other. Of begging for scraps of love. Dot had retired from the post office after 30 years of knowing everyone's business whether they wanted her to or not, and she had sharp eyes behind her reading glasses that missed very little. Of begging for scraps of love. "How's the full house treating you?" she asked, and I gave her some careful, watered-down answer about it being an adjustment, and Dot studied me the way she used to study a suspicious package, tilting her head. Of begging for scraps of love. "That real estate fellow's been by 3 times this week," she said. "Asked me last Tuesday if I knew what the Hendricks place sold for per acre. I told her maybe he was just curious about the neighborhood." Begging for scraps of love. Dot's eyebrows went up over her glasses. "Eleanor," she said, "I worked a postal route for 3 decades. I know curious. This wasn't curious. This was homework. I didn't sleep well that night either." Of begging for scraps of love. I lay in the narrow back bed, in the room that used to hold nothing but sewing scraps, and stared at the ceiling, running Grant's words over and over. The parent signs. She doesn't need to understand the mechanics. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that's what I'm for. Until somewhere near 2 in the morning I got up, took Walter's cedar box down again, that low, familiar creak of the brass latch, the only sound in the sleeping house. Of begging for scraps of love. And this time I opened the sealed envelope with my name on it. His handwriting filled both sides of the page, uneven in places where his stroke had already begun stealing the strength from his hand. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. But every word deliberate, every word entirely, unmistakably Walter. "My dearest Eleanor," it began, "if you're reading this, someone has brought paper into our house, and you are frightened." Of begging for scraps of love, and you are wondering whether you are imagining things. You are not imagining things. I read on with my hand pressed hard against my mouth. "You have always trusted people further than I do," he wrote. "For scraps of love, it's one of the reasons I married you and one of the reasons I worried every single year about what would happen to you after I was gone. If anyone, Eleanor, for scraps of love, and I mean specifically our son, brings you documents about this house, do not sign them, do not explain yourself, call Harold Voss before the sun sets on that conversation, and then 10 years of begging for scraps of love, near the bottom of second page, in handwriting that had grown smaller, more careful, like a man conserving the last of his strength for the words that mattered most. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. There is something else you'll need to know eventually about Bradley from a long time ago, before you and I ever married the second half of our life together into one. Harold has it. For scraps of love, I couldn't tell you while I was well, and I'm too much of a coward to tell you now at the end, when you can't argue with a dying man. Ask Harold when the time comes. You'll know when it's come. I am sorry, Eleanor. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I am sorry for all of it, and I am not sorry for none of it, and I hope somehow you'll understand the difference. I sat on the edge of that narrow bed for a long time after I finished reading, of begging for scraps of love, the letter trembling slightly in my hands, the cedar box open beside me with its brass latch, still faintly warm from the friction of 40 years of use. Something else you'll need to know eventually about Bradley. 10 years of begging for scraps of love from a long time ago. I did not know yet what that sentence meant. I only knew with a certainty that settled into my chest like a stone finding its place in one of Walter's old walls, begging for scraps of love, that the time my husband had warned me about all those months ago in his chair in the amber light had finally unmistakably arrived. The next morning, before Bradley or Kayla had come downstairs, of begging for scraps of love. I called Harold Voss's office and left a message with a steadiness in my voice that surprised even me. "This is Eleanor Marsh," I said, "Walter's wife. I think I need to come in. I think the time has come. Of begging for scraps of love. The way he said it would, Harold Voss's office hadn't changed in the 15 years since I'd last sat in it, the same dark wood shelves sagging under decades of case files. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the same brass lamp on the corner of his desk that had been old when I first met him at our wedding, where he'd stood as Walter's best man and cried more openly than either of us at the altar. Of begging for scraps of love. He was in his 70s now himself, silver-haired and slower on his feet, but his handshake was as firm as ever, and the moment his office door closed behind me, of begging for scraps of love, the friendly small talk fell away from his face like a coat he'd been wearing only for the waiting room. "Tell me everything," he said. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. So I did. The locks Bradley had quietly rekeyed the week after they moved in and been slow to give me a copy of, the bedroom, the wedding photograph in the garage box, of begging for scraps of love. Grant Feld's dinner table talk of unlocking value, the phone call I'd overheard among the roses about a $4 million appraisal and a signature that didn't need my understanding, only my ink. Of begging for scraps of love. Harold listened without interrupting the way he always had, taking notes in handwriting nearly as illegible as Walter's had been in his final months. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and when I finished he sat back in his chair and exhaled slowly through his nose. Walter came to me about 18 months before he died, he said, of begging for scraps of love, and asked me to build protections around Larkspur House that couldn't be undone by anyone but you under very specific conditions with independent counsel present. No power of attorney can override it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. No signature obtained without you physically appearing before an approved notary with a second attorney verifying identity means anything at all. He slid a folder across the desk, and I saw Walter's careful, Chapsen, familiar handwriting in the margins of several pages, notes he'd made to Harold years before his hands had begun to shake. "Your husband," Harold said, "did not trust the world to be kind to you after he was gone, begging for scraps of love. He was not naive about our son, Eleanor. He loved him. But he wasn't naive." I asked the question that had been sitting in my chest since 2 a.m. "There's a second letter," I said, begging for scraps of love. "Walter told me you'd know when I needed to hear about it, about something from a long time ago, something about Bradley." Harold's face changed then, of begging for scraps of love, in a way I hadn't seen it change in 15 years of knowing him, a kind of grief layered over caution, the look of a man carrying something heavy for a very long time and finally being asked to set it down, of begging for scraps of love. "I was hoping you wouldn't need to hear this yet," he said quietly. "But if there's a $4 million loan moving without your consent, I think the time has come faster than either of us wanted." He opened a second, of begging for scraps of love. Older folder, the paper inside yellowed at the edges. "In 1999, when Bradley was 20, he said, there was a young woman named Danielle Cole, of begging for scraps of love. She and Bradley had a relationship your husband knew about and you did not, because Bradley asked him not to tell you, and Walter, against every instinct he had, respected that, of begging for scraps of love, because he believed a young man deserved the chance to fix his own mistakes before his mother found out about them." Harold paused, watching my face carefully. "Danielle had a baby that spring, a girl. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. He told Danielle he wasn't met her, gave her some money to make the situation, as he put it, go away, and never asked another question about the child again. Begging for scraps of love." The room seemed to tilt very slightly. "Walter knew," I said, "all these years, and Walter knew and never told me. He found out that summer," Harold said. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and he was ashamed of 2 things at once, ashamed of his son and ashamed of himself for keeping it from you. He couldn't undo either. What he could do was find Danielle quietly, of begging for scraps of love, and make sure the child never wanted for anything, without either of them ever knowing where the money came from. He did that for 18 years, Eleanor. Every single year of begging for scraps of love. An anonymous contribution to a trust Danielle knew only as a family friend. He told me once it was the only penance he could think of that actually meant something. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, for scraps of love, feeling something enormous and slow-moving rearrange itself inside my chest. Grief for a granddaughter I had never known existed, of begging for scraps of love. Anger at a husband I had loved for 43 years and had somehow still managed to keep an entire hidden decade of himself from me, and underneath all of it, a small, sharp, of begging for scraps of love. Unexpected thread of something that felt almost like hope, though I couldn't yet say why. "Where is she now?" I asked. "This girl. This woman, I suppose, by now." Harold hesitated, and I understood, watching him, begging for scraps of love, that he genuinely did not know the full answer. "Danielle raised her as Renata Cole," he said. "Walter kept tabs quietly until she turned 18 and the trust dissolved into her own name. After that, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. He told me he stopped looking because he said it wasn't his business to watch a life he had no right to be part of. I don't know where she is now, Eleanor. I only know her name. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and that Walter loved her from a distance for 18 years without ever once meeting her, because he thought that was the closest thing to right he was allowed. Of begging for scraps of love, I left Harold's office that afternoon with copies of every protective document Walter had built around our house, and with a name, Renata Cole, that meant nothing to me yet, for scraps of love, sitting in my chest like a seed with no soil to grow in. I want to tell you I understood, on the drive home, how that name would come to matter. I did not. Of begging for scraps of love, I only knew that my husband had left me 2 gifts from beyond his own death, a fortress around our home that Bradley's forged signatures couldn't touch, for scraps of love, and a secret granddaughter I would spend the following weeks quietly, carefully trying to find. I did not tell Bradley or Kayla anything about that visit. Harold's advice was simple and precise. Document everything. Of begging for scraps of love, sign nothing and let them believe for as long as possible that I remained exactly as uncertain and persuadable as they needed me to be. So I became, over the following 2 weeks, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. An actress in my own life in a way I'd never been before. I nodded along when Kayla mentioned, over breakfast, that they'd found a wonderful assisted living community just 20 minutes away. Nothing final, Eleanor. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Just something to think about. I let Bradley walk me through brochures for independent senior living with a patience that cost me more than he ever knew. It's of begging for scraps of love, smiling and asking gentle questions while privately committing every word, every document, every date to the private email account Harold had helped me set up the same week. Of begging for scraps of love. I photographed papers left carelessly on the dining table when Bradley rushed off to meetings without clearing his desk. I wrote down, the moment I was alone, of begging for scraps of love, every fragment of every phone call I overheard through the thin wall between the den and the hallway. Reyes agreed without hesitation to be a witness if it ever came to that. Walter, forgive me. For scraps of love, dear. Would have done the same for me, she said, squeezing my hand on her back porch one evening over iced tea. Of begging for scraps of love, and I had to look away toward her garden for a moment so she wouldn't see what that kindness did to my eyes. The near miss happened on a Thursday. Of begging for scraps of love, and I still think about how differently everything might have gone if it hadn't happened exactly the way it did. Of begging for scraps of love, Bradley was rummaging through the hall closet looking for a set of old blueprints of the house. Grant had asked for them. Of begging for scraps of love. Something about confirming square footage for the appraisal, and in the process he pulled down the shelf where I'd stored Walter's cedar box, not bothering to hide it. Of being for scraps of love, because I'd never imagined my own son would go looking through a closet with that little regard for what he might find. He held the box in both hands for a moment, turning it over, for scraps of love, and I watched from the kitchen doorway with my heart going very still and very fast at once. He worked the latch, that low, familiar creak, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the same sound that had accompanied every important discovery of that entire autumn, and glanced inside for perhaps 4 seconds, long enough to see the deed, not long enough to see the second folder tucked beneath it, of begging for scraps of love, the one with Harold's name and Danielle Cole's old address written on a slip of paper Walter had never gotten around to destroying. "Just Dad's old junk," Bradley said. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, snapping the latch shut again without a second glance, setting the box back on the shelf carelessly enough that it landed at an angle. He never went looking for the blueprints in there again. Of begging for scraps of love, he never opened that box a second time, and I stood in the kitchen doorway afterward with my hand pressed flat against my chest, thinking about how close, how impossibly close, my son had come to discovering for scraps of love. By his own carelessness, the exact thing his carelessness had spent his whole adult life trying not to know. 2 days later, in the parking lot of the grocery store on Route 9, years of begging for scraps of love, I very nearly walked straight past a conversation that would have changed everything if I'd missed it. I was loading bags into my trunk when I heard Grant Feld's voice, unmistakable even at a distance, of begging for scraps of love, coming from 2 cars down where he stood with his phone to his ear and his back half turned toward the store. I don't make a habit of eavesdropping on strangers, of begging for scraps of love, but something in his posture, the low urgency of it, made me slow down, made me take an extra few seconds arranging bags that were already perfectly well arranged. The appraisal expires October the 15th. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, he was saying. If we don't have the notarization locked by then, we start the whole valuation process over, and by then the Hendricks parcel closes and the comps change completely. A pause. I know it's tight. For scraps of love. That's why I need the signature this week, not next week. Another pause, and then, in a tone that made the hair on my arms rise even in the mild autumn air, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Just make sure she's not alone with anybody who'll ask questions before the notary gets there. In and out. It's not complicated unless somebody makes it complicated. Of begging for scraps of love. I stood by my open trunk doing arithmetic I hadn't done since my own working days, counting backward from October the 15th to that very afternoon, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and arriving at a number that settled into my stomach like a stone. 11 days. 11 days until whatever they were planning would either happen or fall apart trying. Of begging for scraps of love. I drove home that afternoon with both hands tight on the wheel and a strange, cold clarity settling over me, the kind Walter used to describe feeling right before he set the final stone in a wall. Not fear exactly. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, of someone who finally understands exactly what they're building toward. That evening, Tyler found me on the back porch after dinner, of begging for scraps of love, carrying 2 mugs of tea the way he always did when he sensed something in the house had shifted and wanted in his quiet 15-year-old way to make sure I wasn't carrying it alone. "Grandma," he said, of begging for scraps of love, sitting beside me on the step, the same step, though he didn't know it, where his own grandfather had once measured his father's height with a pencil mark and a private, hopeful smile. Dad's been weird. Like 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Really weird. I heard him and Mom fighting about money last night. He said if something doesn't happen soon, they're going to lose everything. Begging for scraps of love, not the loan going through smoothly to give me a comfortable retirement, as Bradley had framed it at dinner more than once. Everything of begging for scraps of love. Meaning something had already broken badly enough that a man was willing to forge his own mother's signature to keep it from breaking further. "Do you know who Danielle Cole is?" I asked Tyler carefully. Of begging for scraps of love, because a 15-year-old with sharp eyes and an unguarded phone habit sometimes knows the adults around him assume he doesn't. He shook his head slowly. "No." "Should I?" I told him not yet. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, but that if he ever heard that name or the name Renata come up around the house, I needed him to tell me immediately. He looked at me for a long moment with an expression far older than his years and said, begging for scraps of love, "Is this about the box in the hall closet? Dad found it and just put it back." He didn't even really look. I told him he was a good boy, and I meant it more than he could possibly understand, of begging for scraps of love. The family meeting came 4 days later, on a Sunday evening, exactly the way these meetings always seem to arrive, announced casually over lunch, framed as something loving. Begging for scraps of love. "We just want to sit down together tonight," Bradley said, and I nodded and said, of course. Inside, I felt the strange 10 years of begging for scraps of love, steady calm of a woman who already knows the ending of a story everyone else in the room believes is still being written. We gathered in the living room after dinner. of begging for scraps of love. Bradley opened with the speech I'd been braced for. Everything we're doing comes from a place of love. Mom, you've been through so much. For scraps of love, we're worried about you carrying this house alone. And Kayla nodded along at all the right moments. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Though I watched her hands twist together in her lap in a way that told me some part of her wasn't entirely at ease with the script she was performing. Grant sat slightly apart of begging for scraps of love, a folder of papers already open on the coffee table waiting. We think it makes sense, Bradley said, to put some protections in place. A power of attorney, years of begging for scraps of love, so Kayla and I can help manage things if you ever need us to. And there's an opportunity, Grant's walked us through it, to release some of the equity in the house, which honestly, Mom, at your age, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, sitting on all this value doing nothing. It's not doing nothing, I said quietly. It's where I live. Bradley's jaw tightened, the exact same way it had the night of the dinner party. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and for a moment I saw something flicker behind his eyes that might, in a kinder version of this story, have been shame. Instead, he pushed the folder toward me across the coffee table, papers I recognized instantly. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Having already seen photographs of nearly identical document account Harold had helped me build. Nobody's asking you to sign tonight, he said. Just look it over. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I looked over every page slowly, deliberately, my heart steady in a way that would have surprised the woman I'd been 2 months earlier. Near the bottom of the third page, of begging for scraps of love, my eyes caught on a line I hadn't expected to find quite so soon, quite so plainly, a signature line already signed, my name in a hand that was close, careful, clearly practiced, and entirely of begging for scraps of love. Unmistakably not my own, I set the folder down very gently on the coffee table. This is already signed, I said, keeping my voice level in a way that cost me everything I had. Years of begging for scraps of... This document already has my signature on it. The room went absolutely silent. Kayla's face went pale. Grant's professional smile didn't so much as flicker, which told me, more than anything else that evening, of begging for scraps of love, exactly how many times he'd sat in exactly this kind of room before. Bradley opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. That must be a placeholder, he said, for the template. Scraps of love. It's not final until it's my name, I said, on a document I have never seen before tonight, notarized. I turned the page, my hands steadier than I had any right to expect them to be. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and found the seal at the bottom, the notary's printed name beneath it, notarized 3 days ago by someone named R. Cole. I looked up at my son. Who is R. Cole, Bradley? Of begging for scraps of love. I watched the color drain entirely from his face, watched him glance at Grant, watched Grant, for the first time all evening, fail to produce an answer smooth enough to fill the silence. And I understood, of begging for scraps of love. Sitting in my own living room with a forged version of my own name in my hands, that whatever storm had been building quietly for 2 months was about to break, and that somewhere out there, begging for scraps of love, a young woman I had never met carrying a name that had haunted my husband's conscience for 26 years, had already, without knowing it, of begging for scraps of love, put her own signature on the instrument that was going to bring this entire scheme down around my son's ears. Bradley's silence stretched long enough that even Grant seemed to feel it, of begging for scraps of love, and it was Kayla who finally spoke, in a voice much smaller than the one she usually used at that table. Bradley, she said, who is R. Cole? And when he didn't answer her either, of begging for scraps of love. Something in her face closed over entirely, the practiced warmth of the last 2 months draining out of it and leaving something harder and more frightened underneath. I don't know, Bradley said finally, of begging for scraps of love. Some notary Grant found. It doesn't matter who she is, Mom, it's just a formality. It's just a house, Mom, I said quietly, watching his face. Try to keep up, isn't that what you told me? 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Standing in my bedroom doorway with your father's lamp in your hands? I watched the sentence land on him the way it had landed on me that day, and for the first time since he'd moved back into that house, of begging for scraps of love. You forged mine flinch on a document worth $4 million, and you had it notarized by a stranger before you'd even asked me to look at it. Tell me, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Bradley, was there ever a version of this plan where you actually intended to ask? He didn't answer that either. Grant, sensing the room was no longer his to manage, began quietly gathering his folder of begging for scraps of love, and I told him in a voice I didn't fully recognize as my own, steady, cold, entirely without the tremor I'd expected, that he was welcome to leave, of begging for scraps of love, and that he would be hearing from my attorney before the week was out. He left without a word. Kayla sat very still on the couch, staring at her hands, and Tyler stood frozen in the doorway to the kitchen, of begging for scraps of love, having clearly heard every word of it, his face white. I need you to leave, I told Bradley, and I said it the way Walter used to say the load-bearing sentences in his own life, quietly, once, for scraps of love, without repeating it for emphasis. Not the house, this conversation. I need time, and I am not going to spend it arguing with you tonight. He left. Kayla stayed a moment longer, of begging for scraps of love, opened her mouth as though she might say something, and then closed it again and followed him upstairs, and I sat alone in my living room with a forged document bearing my own name, and felt 10 years of begging for scraps of love. For the first time in 2 months, something that was not quite peace but was at least no longer entirely fear. I called Harold that night. He listened to everything, the forged signature, the notary's name, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The October 15th deadline Grant had mentioned in the parking lot, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment before he said, "Eleanor, I think it's time we let this play out somewhere with witnesses. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, rather than in your living room where it's your word against theirs." He told me his plan the following morning, sitting across from me at his office with 2 cups of coffee going cold between us. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. He would contact the title company handling the loan directly, request to review the notarization on record of begging for scraps of love, and because forged documents notarized under a false appearance of the signer are not just a family matter but a matter for the state notary commission, he would ask, formally, of begging for scraps of love to meet the notary who had signed off on paperwork for a woman who had never once appeared before her. "Her name is R. Cole," Harold said, watching my face carefully as he said it. "Eleanor, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I looked into the title company's staff roster this morning before you arrived. There's a Renata Cole listed as a commissioned notary, 27 years old, 3 years with the firm. Begging for scraps of love." He let that sit in the room a moment. "I think," he said slowly, "that we may be about to meet your husband's second letter in person." The meeting was set for the following Tuesday, begging for scraps of love. At the title company's office downtown, framed to Bradley and Grant as a standard closing verification. A chance, Harold told them over the phone, for all parties to confirm the documents before final recording. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I don't know exactly what Bradley believed was about to happen in that room. I only know that he arrived in a blue suit, confident in the particular way desperate men are confident right up until the moment they aren't, for scraps of love. With Grant beside him carrying his leather folder, and Kayla trailing a half step behind, her face unreadable, I arrived with Harold and with Dot Reyes, of begging for scraps of love, who had insisted on coming as a witness the moment I told her what was happening, and with Tyler, who I'd debated bringing until the last possible moment, and then decided in the end, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that a boy who had spent 2 months quietly protecting his grandmother deserved to see how the story ended. The conference room had a long table and a wall of windows looking out over the parking lot, of begging for scraps of love, and at the head of it, when we walked in, stood a young woman with dark hair pulled back neatly, a notary seal and a stack of files in front of her, glancing up at the sound of the door. For scraps of love. I want to honestly that I did not recognize her, because there was nothing to recognize. I had never seen a photograph of Renata Cole in my life, but something in the room shifted the moment Bradley saw her. For scraps of love. A stillness that spread across his face like ice forming on a pond, and I understood, watching him, that some part of him, some old, buried, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, cowardly part, recognized something in her features that the rest of him had spent 26 years refusing to look at directly. "Mr. Voss," Renata said, addressing Harold with a professional, for scraps of love, slightly wary politeness. You asked to review the notarization on the Marsh equity documents. I have the file here. She slid a folder across the table, and Harold opened it slowly, deliberately, of begging for scraps of love, giving the room time to absorb what was about to happen. Miss Cole, Harold said, can you confirm for everyone here that you personally witnessed Eleanor Marsh sign this document of begging for scraps of love? Renata's eyes moved to me, to my face, for the first time really looking, and something crossed her expression, quick and complicated, before her professional composure closed back over it. No, she said carefully. For scraps of love. I flagged that file 3 days ago. The woman who appeared before me for that signature did not match the identification presented. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I refused to complete the notarization and reported the discrepancy to my supervisor the same afternoon. She looked at Grant. I was told it would be resolved internally. The room went very still. For scraps of love. Bradley's face had gone the color of old paper. There's some mistake, he started, and Renata cut him off, not unkindly, but with the flat of begging for scraps of love, professional certainty of someone who had already made up her mind about the facts 3 days earlier and had no reason now to doubt them. There's no mistake, Mr. Marsh, she said. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I've been doing this job for 3 years. I know the difference between a real signature and a woman standing in for one. I stepped forward then, and 10 years of Walter's cedar box on the table. I had brought it with me that morning, though I hadn't fully understood why until that exact moment, only that it had felt important, of begging for scraps of love, the way Walter's instincts always turned out to be important. I opened the latch, that same low, familiar creak, and the sound of it in that quiet conference room seemed to still the whole space further, of begging for scraps of love, as though everyone in it recognized without being told that something significant was about to happen. Before I say anything else, I said, begging for scraps of love. I want everyone in this room to understand something my late husband believed, and I have come to believe just as fully in the last 2 months. A signature isn't just ink on a line. It's a person standing behind it, of begging for scraps of love, telling the truth about who they are. My son forged mine because he didn't think it mattered whether I stood behind it or not. I want to show you what happens when someone finally does. I lifted the deed from the box, of begging for scraps of love, and beneath it the 2 envelopes. One addressed simply to Eleanor, already read, its contents already known to everyone but Kayla and Tyler in that room, and the second, which I had not opened, of begging for scraps of love, addressed in Walter's careful, failing handwriting. For Renata, if the day ever comes that she needs to know. I looked up at the young woman across the table whose composure had, 10 years of begging for scraps of love for the first time since we'd entered the room, begun to crack at the edges. I think this is yours, I said, sliding the envelope across the table toward her. It's been waiting for you for 2 years. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. My husband wrote it not knowing whether you'd ever walk into our lives, only hoping if you did that someone would be there to hand it to you. Renata stared at the envelope for a long moment without touching it, of begging for scraps of love. I don't understand, she said quietly. Who are you people? My name is Eleanor Marsh, I said. My husband was Walter Marsh. And I believe, I said, watching her face, watching the exact moment the pieces began. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, slowly to arrange themselves behind her eyes, that you are the daughter my son fathered in 1999 and never once tried to meet. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight, of begging for scraps of love, the kind you can feel pressing against your chest. Bradley made a small, strangled sound, somewhere between a word and a breath. Kayla's hand flew to her mouth. Tyler, standing near the door, went absolutely rigid. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, staring at Renata with an expression I can only describe as recognition arriving too late to be useful. The particular set of her jaw, I realized later, was the same set of jaw Bradley had, and Walter before him, of begging for scraps of love, a family resemblance that had been sitting in that room the entire time unspoken. My father, Renata said slowly, and her eyes went for the first time to Bradley, standing frozen at the far end of the table. For scraps of love is a stonemason's son who paid my mother to disappear and never asked another question about me. Her voice was flat, controlled, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the voice of someone who had rehearsed this exact realization 100 times in her head over the years without ever expecting to need it in a conference room. I've known his name since I was 16, of begging for scraps of love. I never once tried to find him because everything my mother told me about him told me I already knew everything I needed to know. Oh, he didn't know you existed until this moment, I said gently. For scraps of love, not really, not as a person walking through the world, only as a fact he'd been paying to forget. But my husband knew, Walter knew from the year you were born, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and he was ashamed enough of what his son had done that he spent every year after that quietly making sure you never went without anything, through a trust he never let your mother trace back to him. Of begging for scraps of love, he wanted to tell you himself someday. He didn't get the chance. I nodded toward the envelope still unopened in her hands. I think that's what's inside. For scraps of love. Renata's hands were not entirely steady as she broke the seal. She read it silently. Of begging for scraps of love, standing at the head of that conference table with her father frozen at the other end of it and her grandmother, a woman she had met 11 minutes earlier, watching her from beside a cedar box that still smelled faintly of 40-year-old wood. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I won't pretend to know every word Walter wrote to a granddaughter he never met because that letter belonged to her, and she has never shared its full contents with anyone outside our family. Of begging for scraps of love, and I respect that boundary completely. But she read one line aloud, her voice breaking only slightly on the words because I think some part of her needed to say it out loud in that room. Of begging for scraps of love, in front of the man who had never come looking, he wrote. Renata said, I could not undo what my son did to you before you could even open your eyes, but I could make sure that whatever you needed, for scraps of love, someone was quietly standing behind you even if you never knew his name. I hope if you're reading this, begging for scraps of love, it's because you finally got the chance to stand in a room and be seen for exactly who you are, not who anyone decided you'd be before you had a say in it. She looked up then, directly at Bradley, and her voice, of begging for scraps of love when she spoke again, was no longer flat. You forged an old woman's signature, she said, for $4 million, and I'm the one who caught it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Do you have any idea how many nights I used to lie awake wondering if you ever thought about me at all? And it turns out the answer was yes, you thought about me exactly once, 26 years ago, of begging for scraps of love, and decided the fastest way to solve the problem was money. Bradley opened his mouth and nothing came out. I don't need an apology, Renata said, begging for scraps of love. I need you to understand that I was never the problem you paid to disappear. I was a person the whole time. I still am. It was Harold, finally, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, who brought the room back to the matter that had assembled everyone in it in the first place, though his voice was gentler than I'd ever heard it. Given what's been established here today, he said, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Regarding the forged signature and the notary's refusal to certify it, I believe this loan application is dead on arrival, and I intend to notify the title company's compliance office, begging for scraps of love, as well as the state notary commission, that Ms. Cole acted with complete professional integrity throughout. He turned to Bradley. As for the criminal exposure around the forgery itself, begging for scraps of love, that will be Eleanor's decision to make, not mine and not yours. Every eye in the room turned to me. I looked at my son, my only child, who I had carried and raised and buried a husband beside. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, who had once been a small boy running barefoot down a gravel road with feet tough as boot leather, who had grown into a man capable of forging his own mother's name because he had decided, somewhere along the way, of begging for scraps of love, that her consent was an inconvenience rather than a requirement. I thought about Walter's voice from his chair in the amber light, "Don't sign anything." I thought about the second letter, of begging for scraps of love, and the granddaughter it had finally delivered to me standing 11 feet away with a stranger's face that was somehow, unmistakably, also my husband's face and my son's face, looking back at me. Of begging for scraps of love. I'm not going to press charges today, I said slowly, and I felt Bradley's shoulders drop with relief before I finished the sentence. But I want to be very clear about what happens next, and none of it is optional. of begging for scraps of love. I looked at Grantfeld's empty chair. He had slipped out sometime during Renata's letter, and I suspected we would be hearing from lawyers about his own conduct before long. The house stays exactly where it is, of begging for scraps of love, protected exactly the way Walter built it to be protected, and no one signs anything on my behalf, ever again, for any reason. And you, I said to Bradley, 10 years of begging for scraps of love are going to tell your son the truth about why we're all standing in this room, because I refuse to let one more person in this family learn something this important secondhand the way I did, of begging for scraps of love. I want to tell you that Bradley cried, that he crossed the room and embraced his daughter, and everything healed cleanly in that conference room, the way it does in the stories people tell at church. Of begging for scraps of love, that is not what happened. What happened is that my son stood very still for a long moment, looking at Renata, and finally said in a voice smaller than I had heard from him in 20 years, of begging for scraps of love, I don't know how to do this. And Renata, who owed him absolutely nothing, said only, you don't have to know today, before gathering her files, professional again, composed again, and telling us quietly, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that she needed to step out of the room for a few minutes. Kayla was the one who followed her. I didn't learn what passed between Kayla and Renata in the hallway outside that conference room until much later. 10 years of begging for scraps of love.